He'd tasted iron and thunder in the air before he heard the word, Father. It arrived small, breath-soft, as if spoken in a church where no God had answered in years. And it dragged the sound of his own name out from some place inside him he had carefully buried. Boyhood nights of wolf song and hearth smoke, the hollow ache of abandonment he'd learned to wear like armor. Around him, the Lycan court held its breath as if clipped by a blade. The murmurs stopped mid-phrase. The guards' hands froze on hilts. And Mara, Queen Mara, whose teeth had broken more enemies than alliances, tilted her head the way only a monarch who had never asked for anything did when startled. The valley itself seemed to lean closer to listen. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Elias felt the floor shift under him, though his boots lay on stone. He'd come expecting protocol, the scripted barbs of politics, the thin, dangerous civility that had kept the border between human lands and Lycan territories from boiling over for seasons. He had not expected a child's voice to unmake him. He had certainly not expected Mara to look at him with something that was almost, unfathomably, like pleading. Leela sat beside the queen, a tangle of dark curls and defiant angles, her small jaw set against the wind. She was not a mere accessory to sovereignty. She radiated a kind of feral ferocity, eyes bright and unmuzzled with the mix of human curiosity and lupine hunger that marked half-bloods. She had come with Mara to open the negotiations on territory lines and trade, a diplomatic statement that bred confidence in allies and fear in rivals. Instead, she leaned forward, the word father leaving her like a stone thrown across the basin of the valley, and the stone made concentric ripples none of them would ignore. Mara's hand tightened on the arm of her throne until knuckles blanched. Queens did not ask, they commanded. Yet her voice, when she addressed Elias, was a blade tempered with something softer than he had seen in her eyes since before the wars. You were summoned as liaison, Elias. Speak. The pack around her watched, jaws slack, because a queen's command was a law. A queen's vulnerability was a new kind of treason. He could have fled then. He had fled before, across borders and through moonlit forests, carrying secrets and the weight of a life that had nearly broken him under the heel of allegiance and survival. He could have let his old oath hold the shape it always had: silence, distance, a life in the shadows. Instead, the child's name wrapped around his ribs and would not let him be a ghost. Up close, her scent hit him, pine sap, salt from tears shed in hidden places, and the wild undercurrent of her wolf blood, and his mouth went dry. The past, its treacheries, its cold bargains, woke in him like a dog roused at the scent of prey. I don't understand," he said, and his own voice sounded foreign in the hall, thinner than the steel that had steadied it through so many winters. He searched Mara's face for the ghost of a joke, a test, anything he could use to anchor himself. There was no mask now between the queen and the pack. Instead, there was a fissure where authority met private ruin. The courtiers leaned in, the betas' whispers a low tide of speculation. The valley had always loved a scandal, the way wolves love the scent of blood. Lila's eyes flared like twin moons. "You were always at the edge," she said, as if reciting a memory shared with the wind, with the stone markers at the border. "You brought bread sometimes. You told stories. You smelled like gunpowder and cinnamon. You laughed when my mother taught me to howl into the dark." The hall crawled with 1,000 invisible threads pulling toward Elias, fact,
accusation, hope, each one barbed. Someone moved to stand. No one dared. Mara's deputies watched Elias like they watched a contained wolf, both fascinated and ready to strike. 2 winters ago, Elias had done things that made peace possible, a sabotage that turned a looming war into scraps, a forged letter that let a convoy pass. It had been a dark bartering with shadows. He had meant then to pay a debt he had no right to collect. He had meant to go quietly back to the Edgelands afterward, to sun and solitude. Instead, his return here placed him inside the Queen's light again, where every corner birthed a surveillance of loyalty. He saw angling faces he had known as allies and enemies. He felt old guilt like a second skin. Mara's jaw flexed. She was not blind to the hazard a single human face could become within her court. Humanity was both a vulnerability and a scandal if it entered the lines of succession, of command. She had made choices that kept her pack whole. She had salted away tenderness so she could rule. Yet she had also, in moments when the moon bled and memories blurred, reached for a human warmth that did not belong to the hierarchy she upheld. Her arms, which were strong enough to woo battle and policy alike, had once been thinner, more uncertain. The memory of that past night, hazy and dangerous, lay like smoldering coal under her ribs. She had wrapped it with ash and sworn never to feed it. But children remember heat. "You were a soldier," Abeda said finally, the voice small as a rat but carrying the requisite venom. "You betrayed us once for coin. Why should a queen trust the man who turned his back when wolves needed him?" It was not accusation flung with justice, but with hunger for rupture. The pack had long sought any reason to shift the balance. Rumor was fertilizer. Mara's eyes snapped to the speaker, and her presence alone flattened dissent into nervous coughs. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted, and reamers, once sown, sprout their own teeth. Elias had no official claim to Lila, nor any legal right to stand between queen and pack. He was a human among wolves, a liaison who had once held secrets that bent fates. But the syllable the child had used was not an accident. She called him father the way a tether calls a ship to a dock. He felt it tug at him with such force that all his practiced anonymity collapsed. He thought of nights when he had tucked a younger Mara against his shoulder as moonlight painted her hair silver and the valley slept like a beast with its belly full. He thought of a single visit when the queen had been young, reckless with grief and empire. He remembered, with the clarity and agony of a man who had swallowed too much wine and too many truths, a night where power traded places with need. Did Lila carry his blood? He saw the outline of his own rounded ears in her hair, the slope of his jaw in the handful of lashes against her cheek. The possibility choked him. No one in the court expected tenderness from Mara, and yet those who served closest to her knew the secret of the queen's night terrors, the way she woke sometimes from the same dream of a small face peering into battle smoke. A monarch could govern through fear, but fear alone could hollow a throne. Elias could have been the offal of policy, a rumor to be crushed. Instead, he stood with the tax of his own muted longing, like a man who had nothing left to lose but shame. "You summoned me," he said finally, careful, because every word in a hall like this was a lever that moved more than muscle. "If you want trade, if you want the boundary set, then speak orders and I will record them. If this is something else," his hand lifted, helpless, toward Lila, feeling the shock of honest tenderness like a vice on his ribs. He had no children. He had no illusions about the safety of such a claim. He had only the truth of his memory and the raw ache of a man who had never been called father. Mara's face shifted then in a way that might have been pity if she were capable of pity. It was more likely the tightness of a woman who knew that admitting need was a currency she could not spend without losing more than she intended. "You served our interests when it suited you," she said coolly. "You were useful, but the pack is not a ledger you can write upon. If this is a trick, Elias of the Edgelands, then we will end it cleanly." Her words were a gavel. The betas let a tiny, eager smile curl at one corner of their mouths, the feral expression of creatures that had long chafed under her iron will and sought any fracture to gnaw. Yet, beneath the surface of her command was an old, private tidal pool of feeling. Elias recognized the guarded tremor in her hand. She had not called him to humiliate him. She had called him because there are truths which, when left to rot in the dark, spill poison into the body politic. She had called him because a child had named him, and marauders from rival packs were already moving like vultures along the ridge, smelling vulnerability. Outside the great doors of the hall, the valley breathed its own rumination. Snow powdered on the firs. A hawk threaded the cliffs. The moon would rise soon, and with it, the things that are larger than law: instinct, hunger, reckoning. Elias felt the press of the valley's waiting like cold breath on his neck. He had intended to ask for nothing. The word had arrived like a summons he had not written and could not ignore. The court's silence was a pronouncement. Nothing here would be the same. The immediate choice unfurled in him with all the inevitability of a wound. He could step back into the anonymity he had carved for himself, let the pack settle, let the queen close the fissure in whatever way she chose, perhaps by naming a different man, perhaps by forging an alliance. Or he could answer the child's claim with truth, and in doing so lay claim not simply to a possible bloodline, but to the kind of intimacy that toppled thrones, to ask for a place in the life of a kingdom that had never wanted humans inside its circle of trust. The stakes were brutal and simple. Whatever he chose, his life as he had known it would fracture. Lila reached for him then, not with the hunger of a wolf, but the tentative curiosity of a child testing gravity. Her fingers brushed his palm, warm and startlingly human, and the sound that escaped him was not a promise, but a crack, something that might become a confession. The valley watched as if a whole history hung in the balance of that tiny touch. Mara's voice dropped to a whisper that only Elias and Lila could hear. "Tell me what happened that night," she said, and the court tightened like a net. Her command was no longer for border peace, but for personal truth. The queen who had ruled through prophecy and steel now sought an answer that might redeem or destroy her. Elias swallowed. He could walk away. He could leave the valley to its suspicions and its predators. But the child's face, lit with a moon silver that made her look more wolf than girl for a fraction of a breath, made him see a life he had never permitted himself to imagine. Outside, the wind took up a note that sounded like a warning. Inside, power and longing braided into a dangerous thing. The first act had closed on a single syllable, and with it, the fragile map of allegiances shifted. The valley held its breath, waiting to see which of them would break and which would bend towards something that might one day be called family. Elias felt the queen's whisper as though she had put a blade at his throat and forgone the theatrics of court. The request, "Tell me what happened that night," was a summons of a different sort. It stripped him of the thin, practiced distance he'd worn like armor and left him raw. Around them, the pack leaned in, curiosity a living thing. Even the guards who had trained themselves to ignore personal collapse found their pulses quicken. He remembered the night with the clarity of someone who had lived two lives and never quite merged them. The cold had been honest then, the kind that made skin speak. He had been younger, taken by urgency and the brittle logic of survival. Mara had been younger too, not the iron woman who now sat enthroned, but a creature softened by grief and a taste of something she had been taught to deny.
Elias had thought, foolishly, that a single heat could be contained between two people who wore duty like second skins. He had been wrong. It rained, he said at first, because the truth had always been easier when wrapped in weather. Not much, just a scatter at the start. I was passing through on a courier route. The border was messy that season. There were patrols, and I was trying to avoid them. I saw her, Lila, by the fire. She was small, half asleep, and Mara. He stopped because the memory of Mara unarmored was a thing that could undo men. He could see her then, hair unpinned, face a map of exhaustion, laughter caught in her throat. She asked for bread, he finished, miserly with words. I gave what I had. She asked me to stay for a story. I stayed for a story, and he swallowed down the rest like a pill. The truth tasted sharp. The court, which had been architected to render private acts into public currency, held its breath. Here was a confession with no tidy ends, no convenient political spin. The Queen's stoicism did not crack. It reformed into something like wonder. For the first time since he had known her as a figure of inalterable will, Elias saw a woman puzzled by the consequences of her own past. "But you left!" a chorus of voices accused, some stinging, some curious, some plainly opportunistic. The betas, smelling the change of season in the air, tested the seam of her composure. "You chose exile instead of family." He had left because leaving had been survival. He had left because the war that would take Mara's mercy, or perhaps take Mara herself, had crept closer. Because information was a coin that bought safety, and he had chosen the price that preserved his solitude. Because to stay would have been to become a liability to every pack and every human who could profit from a queen's tenderness. He had fled then with a coward's carefulness and a soldier's skill. And in fleeing, he had made a sacrifice that now gnawed at the edges of his chest. Lila, who had spoken that explosive word, did not look like a child who had been betrayed. She looked like one who had been deliberately given a hole to fill. Her eyes, wide and honest, begged a tenderness that was not a political maneuver. She slid from her throne to stand before him, the movement feline, immediate. "You were there," she insisted. "You taught me to make knots that hold when ropes are old. You told me not to fear blood because it shows you are alive. You whispered songs late when Mara slept, and the moon listened." The small defiance in her voice cut with its purity. She had been built of edges and truth in a world that preferred polished lies. Mara's hands, which had signed treaties and ordered executions, trembled in a manner that made Elias feel culpable and compelled all at once. She had kept Lila's paces rigorously. She had trained the child to sit when commanded, to watch for flank attacks, to hide the softness that could betray them. Yet here, in the center of her court, strained by the weight of leadership, she allowed a private wound to show. "Why now?" she asked quietly, to both Elias and the child. "Why bring this into the council?" "Because I wanted him to know," Lila said simply. "I wanted him to know I exist." There was the truth in its nakedness. No diplomacy, no scheming. The act enraged the betas and softened Mara in equal measure. Elias felt the old hunger to protect the thing that had called him father flare inside, a protector propensity he had spent a lifetime learning to quell. The irony of being called to guard by the very creature who could end him amused no one. The court demanded more than memory. It demanded a narrative that could be regulated, absorbed, and then used. If Elias's story could be aligned to law and lineage, then perhaps the political threat could be managed. If not, if it disordered more than it explained, the pack might rend itself in reaction. That was the stage where hatred fed and loyalties dissolved into small wars. "You claim a memory," Mara said, voice razor smooth. "You offer emotion where proof could be demanded. In the interest of governance, we require veracity."
The words were hardly merciless. They were practical, the cold hand of sovereignty reminding a man of his place. Elias felt the words like frost. He had no papers. He had no witnesses. He had only a few crude recollections, a handful of tokens, an embroidered scrap, a coin threaded into Lila's hair. Stuff children and lovers trade when they want to make the world keep a secret. He stepped forward then, the old soldier line in his posture demanding attention. He pulled from beneath his coat a scrap of cloth, faded with the kind of wear that suggested both age and care. It was cloth he had bought in a market 2 towns over and given to Mara to swaddle her when she shivered with a fever. He could have said it was nothing. He could have let politics make his silence honorable. Instead, he laid the fabric on the floor between them, like an offering, and watched the room constrict. Lila knelt to touch it as a child might touch the surface of a pond. Her fingers traced the weave with an intimacy that made Elias ache. It was a small ritual, but one that told him he was no longer an intruder in her realm. The court watched this action as if it were legal testimony. A murmur rose, then fell away, as if the hall were not ready for that kind of tenderness. "What did you see?" Mara demanded next, to Elias, not to the pack. "Was there anything else? Names? A place?" She spoke like a woman who feared the implications of a single missing fact more than the presence of an unexpected love. The question was a snare and an olive branch tied together. She wanted information to anchor a scandal into something controllable. Elias told her what he could, of a night lit by a thin rain, of the smell of pines and bread, of laughter swallowed by the valley's breath. He recited the small things, how Lila liked her stories about the river to end tragically so she could feel she had survived. How she scraped her knee on a stone and blamed the world theatrically. He spoke with the kind of detail that comes from a memory folded into the body. He did not, could not, present proof of blood. He had none. His words were the only currency he carried. After he finished, the hall watched Mara, who folded in on herself like a map being closed. She weighed the absence of certainty against the presence of a child who loved and a man who had returned. Duty pressed against an ache she had long tried to starve. "You cannot be the only human she knows," she finally said, aloud but weary. "There are histories to consider. There are enemies who will pretend fatherhood to break bonds. And you, Elias, what do you want? A house? A title? Mercy?" The question was merciless because Elias did not know how to answer it. The life he had built, measured in quiet, in borders crossed respectfully, in the few friends who knew him, was incompatible with the life that would include a child of a queen. To want power for power's sake was not his way. To ask for safety for a child he had only glimpsed was dangerous in its moral simplicity. He found, instead, that he wanted something smaller and bigger all at once. He wanted to be permitted to be present. He wanted to be allowed to speak, to touch, to teach knots, to make small promises a child might trust. He wanted to be allowed to fail and be corrected in the sight of others. When he said it, his voice cracked with honesty. "I want to be there when she learns to stitch or how to sleep without fear of the dark," he said. It was not a political claim. It was a plea. Some faces softened, surprising faces of those who had longed for something gentler to animate the court. Others narrowed into practical considerations. A warlike murmur threaded through the room as rival alphas beyond the valley's edge caught wind of the fissure. In the hum of strategy that followed, Elias felt something else, the pack sizing him, like wolves circling to test a new member. Some tested with teeth, others with eyes that sought to understand. Mara considered him for a long time, as if weighing the sound of his voice on her tongue. Finally, she rose, a movement graceful as any stalking. "You will remain," she declared, and it was not a law, but an experiment. "You will be granted limited access. You will be observed. This ends the matter for now." Her decree was a bargain, fragile, conditional, a thing that might be rescinded. Yet the betas bristled, and somewhere beyond the hall, alliances re-evaluated their maps. Elias exhaled like someone who had been underwater too long. The relief was immediate and as dangerous as it was sweet. He had not won a title. He had not been given a place at the heart of the court. But he had been allowed proximity, and that, in a kingdom built on dominance, could be everything. As they left the hall, Leela at Mara's side and Elias following like a strange new shadow, the valley seemed to breathe differently. The trees that bordered the court shivered in a wind that smelled now of salt and fresh bread. Conversation had shifted tonality across the pack. The old songs of duty were threaded now with hesitance, curiosity, and worry. The rumor of the queen's soft spot had spread. The scent of vulnerability is a dangerous perfume in a world that values strength above all. Outside, under a sky the color of antique silver, Leela turned and, with the candid frankness of a child who owns the world in her small fists, asked Elias a question that undid him more thoroughly than any courtly inquiry. "Will you teach me how to tie a knot that never comes undone?" The question mapped possibility. Elias knelt, not as a supplicant, but as someone who had learned to be present for small rituals. "Yes," he said, and his voice was plain and steady. "I will teach you how to make a knot that holds." The answer did not settle the pack quietly. It created ripples, dangerous, tender, and irrevocable. As they walked back towards the quarters that would be Elias's temporary lodgings, the air thrummed with the sense of forces assembling. Allies would test, enemies would plan, and Mara would calculate the cost of permitting a human to live within her circle. For Elias, the days to come were already configured like a map of choices. He had judged the risk and chosen proximity. He had claimed neither throne nor title, but had asked for a place at a child's side. That night, in the lodgings filled with the smell of wood smoke and the faint echo of the court's murmurs, Elias lay awake and thought of knots. He thought of how they could be both practical and symbolic, how a simple loop, once tightened, could hold a ship fast against a storm. He thought of the way the pack's loyalty might be fastened or torn depending on the tiny decisions he would make in the coming days. Outside, the moon climbed, impartial and glowing, pressing its pale judgment down on a valley that preferred its problems solved with teeth and law. In a world where power had always been measured by bite and command, Elias felt something unfamiliar and terrifying, the desire to be held to something by love, not by law. It was a perilous wish, and yet, as the wind threaded the eaves with a sound like distant wolves, he felt a warmth gathering in his chest, the beginnings of a knot being tied, not around a mast, not around a door, but around the fragile, stubborn hope that had been planted in the hall when a child said a single impossible word. The first fracture opened not with teeth, but with a whisper that stole through the servants' tunnels and into the ears of a rival alpha 2 ridges over. He did not need proof. Rumor is fertilizer, and wolves are quick to plant. Within days, the valley's thin treaty lines shivered with new scent, an offering to the predatory calculus of power. A band of mercenaries, not wolves yet, but men with iron in their hands and alpha promises in their mouths, arrived claiming they came for trade. They came, really, because news of a queen's soft place spreads faster than winter. Mara smelled the trap before her betas did.
a predatory bouquet of coin, threat, and flattery meant to gouge her open. She moved like a winter-trained thing, precise and cold. Elias watched the way her shoulders set, the queen's armor slipping back on, as though the moment in the hall had been some brief, dangerous aberration. But the pack is not a single animal. It is a chorus of mouths and ambitions. When the rival Alpha's envoy met with Mara's council, ears pricked on both sides. The Alpha offered gifts and veiled offers of protection, if only the queen would accept his son as a ward, as an ally through marriage. He spoke of lineage and strength, of stability in exchange for loyalty. The idea was blunt: bind us with blood, and we will not test you. To the betas who had always dreamed of less iron and more ease, it sounded like a solution. To the queen, it was a demand and an insult. Elias found himself dragged into the council not as a liaison, but as an emblem. The Alpha's men, reading the valley's new map, took his presence as leverage. If the court allowed a human proximity, so an Alpha's courtiers argued, then why not other entanglements? Why not negotiated marriages or hidden loyalties that could be woven strong enough to strangle the sovereign's independence? The betas considered the calculus. A human's influence on the queen's child could grant a rival leverage that the pack could not afford. In the kitchens and the outer wards, conversations once framed in weather and harvest now used different words: legitimacy, bloodline, and treason. The term father had become a ticking device. It was useful and dangerous. Some elders remembered a softer Mara and frowned, their memories, like mended clothing, frayed at the seams. They wanted to avoid war and welcomed any alliance that might avert it. Others, young and quick to ambition, tasted the opportunity to push Mara into a corner where she might either make a concession or be forced into weakness. The pack directionalized itself into currents pulling against one another. It was the betas who acted first, testing the seam between Mara's tenderness and her claim to unassailable rule. They convened a private vote, small, a whisper vote among those who wanted to see the queen's authority redefined. The motion was simple: require a formal paternity test. It was framed in governance, not malice. Law must be blind and binding. Mara received the suggestion like a blade buried under a cloth. To demand a test of lineage was to demand a public humiliation, but to refuse was to leave speculation to fester into conspiracy. She could call the question treasonous, or she could answer it and risk being a spectacle. Pride warred with politics. Elias did not know the mechanics of Lycan law. He knew of the old rites, blood-sharing, scent-binding, trials under a full moon, but he had never been a subject of them. For him, the court's argument sounded less like legalism and more like theater. He watched Mara grapple in private ways she had never allowed before. She convened her closest advisors and lay her dilemma out. If she allowed a paternity test, she would be putting her private life on display, and a rival could use it as a lever to unpack her history. If she refused, she would appear to the pack as a queen hiding a weakness. The debate was a strain on her face that opened old scars. "It will destroy the child," one of her oldest betas said bluntly. "She will be paraded, measured, and if blood is used as currency, then what becomes of her? We would sell a girl's safety for the sake of a vote." The defense sounded like a small animal trying to ward a bear. The counter-argument, harsh and efficient, insisted that governance must survive emotion. The council's cleaving left Elias with the sense of being watched from all sides by creatures who could not see the interior of someone's heart. Then, a new layer peeled back. Someone found the remnants of Elias's old life. A courier who had once been Elias's contact in the Edgelands, one of the few who knew where he'd gone and why, had been questioned by the rival Alpha scouts. Men who deal in favors keep records in their ornamented minds. Someone remembered a soldier who'd once traded false maps for safe passage.
A rumor slid quickly from lips to teeth. Elias had been a spy. He had once fed information to factions that had left families broken on both sides. For those in the court who had already doubted the man because of his human breathing, this was a feast. Mara met the accusation with a look that split the air between them. Her voice became the shape of ice. "You say he betrayed us," she said, and the room inhaled. "Show me proof." The man who accused could not produce it without revealing his own debts. The court liked spectacle, true, but it also liked certainty. Accusation without proof is a spark that warms only those eager to be on the side of what breaks. Elias felt the accusation the way a knife bends in a pocket. He had done what he had to do once, aligned with whoever would keep him alive. He had convinced himself it was for a greater good. He had lied to keep a queen and her pack from extinction in a season when the valley might have burned. To announce such complicity now would be to hand his life to the court already hungry for a prize. He could confess and be used, or refuse and be framed. The choice tightened his chest into a fist. Lila, unwittingly complicit in the chaos that followed her single word, began to fracture under pressure that had nothing to do with her childish needs. She was shuffled between teachers and guards. She was observed, given reams of training to harden her into a symbol instead of letting her remain a child. That alone began to eat at the seams of her behavior. Where once she had been fierce and bright, she began to pull inward like a small animal learning to curl in a cage. Her laughter, when it came, seemed like a tremor. Elias watched, and the ache in his ribs became a burning hunger to protect her from the things that had nothing to do with her. The rival Alpha capitalized on the confusion. He sent a messenger in the night with a direct proposal. Remove the human influence, install a warded marriage, and we will protect you from the brigands along the ridge. The message was a calculation presented like mercy. Mara received it in silence and thought of the valley's precariousness, the centuries of survival that had hardened her instinct into one unbending rule: never allow love to be currency for safety. She remembered the faces of those she had lost because she had once allowed softness to creep into governance. The memory had cost lives. To accept the rival's bargain would be to gamble her pack's independence on a personal compromise that might undo the very thing she had fought to preserve. Beneath the political chess, there was another fracture growing, between Mara and Elias. The more she weighed the public implications of his presence, the more she pushed him away under the guise of protocol. She assigned him duties that kept him near the borders, but far from the inner life of the court. He understood the tactical reasons, but felt the sting of personal rejection like a new cut. He had asked to be present at Leela's side, and she had given him proximity without permission, a liminal space that tasted like both gift and cage. Mara, for her part, found herself irritated by his simplicity, the way he spoke to children, the way he held a spoon, the way he smelled of different winters. Her irritation was a private pressure valve. It was easier to be angry at softer things than to admit vulnerability. Then the betas, impatient and ambitious, staged a public test. In the market square, where the everyday transactions of the valley took place, and where the pack's breath met the people's, they orchestrated a scene to force the queen's hand. A group of men, hired, eager, and drunk on the scent of upheaval, accused Elias of being a spy openly. They shouted of past betrayals and of how a human's presence could behold the queen in weakness. The market's crowd, hungry for engagement and spectacle, surged. Leela, training with a tutor, was brought by a guard to the square and forced to watch as her would-be father was paraded like a thing that could be judged. The sight of Elias standing in the square, hands tied not by law but by convenience, transformed something in Mara. Seeing him vulnerable in the market, open to the wolf mouths and the rumor feeders, her control snapped. She moved through the crowd like a tide, her voice a clean cut. "Enough," she declared, and for a breath the square quieted. Her authority returned, not because of ceremony, but because her presence filled the space like a wall. But the act of intervening did not erase the humiliation. It deepened it. Elias looked at her then with a complicated look that was both grateful and wounded. That look lodged itself in Mara's chest like a stone she could not move. Afterward, the private conversations became knives. Elias found an old ally in the form of a woman named Selene, a medicine wolf who had been exiled briefly in youth for the crime of keeping a human in her cottage. She had returned and been reabsorbed, not fully trusted, but useful. Selene whispered to Elias in the quiet hours, telling him the legal routes and the rituals he could consent to that would both prove or disprove paternity. There was a ritual under the next full moon, a binding of scent and blood that would reveal lineage in a way the pack would accept. It was intimate, dangerous, and public. The irony was that such a ritual would force Mara to expose herself as much as Elias. Elias considered the ritual like a man calculating whether to jump into a river he suspected had whirlpools. If he consented, he might vindicate himself and anchor a bond that would protect Lila. If he refused, he would be cast as a coward or liar. The stakes were not merely his freedom, but the safety of a child who had started this fire by calling him father without policy's permission. He wanted to hold her, to teach her knots and songs, and he understood that to do so, he might have to submit himself to a procedure that would strip him bare. In the quiet that followed, Mara retreated into a solitude that was different from before. It was not the armor she wore into battle, but the sort of absence she used to feed the pack's myths. She walked the ridgelines and sat where the wind could cut her into pieces. It was there, looking out at the moon's rising, that she admitted to herself something she had not allowed, that the idea of a child with the blood of a human inside her walls threatened her less than the possibility of losing that small face to rumor and bargaining. The admission was the size of a small winter's hearth, private and dangerous. Rumor had become engine enough to move forces, and forces were gathering on both sides. Tension threaded through the valley like the first thin cracks of ice on a river. The coming days would demand choices, binding rituals or formal votes, alliances or isolation. And in the middle of it all sat a child who had set the valley's course with a single word, and a man who had been called father and must decide whether to be one in flesh and proof or to retreat into the lone life he knew best. As night settled and the wolves beyond the ridge began to sing their lonely songs, Elias stood by the window of his temporary lodging and allowed himself to imagine a bond beyond proof and law. It was not victory he saw, but a fragile possibility, a hand threaded into another, a knot tied small and strong. The fragility was both terror and hope. The valley would either accept what was offered or tear it apart to see what the pieces were worth. In the brittle hush before the full moon, the fractures widened until they threatened to split something whole. The questions had multiplied, and the answers would require confession, sacrifice, and a courage that was not simply the courage of a soldier, but of a man willing to stand inside a wolf pack's storm for the sake of a child's trust. The moon bled full and round when Mara finally moved from solitude into action, and when she came for Elias, it was not as a queen summoning a subject, but as a woman who had decided the shape of the wound she would stitch. She found him in the small chamber by the stables, hands curled around a mug that steamed with some bitter herb. He looked up as she entered, surprise sharpening, then folding into something like surrender. "We will not be governed by rumor," she said without preamble. The words were law, but the tenderness behind them trembled. There is a ritual beneath the old ash on the night of the wolf moon. If you will stand in it, we will either bind you into the valley or remove you from it forever. The pack will accept what the rites declare. Elias's first impulse was to balk. He had fled compacts before. He had measured words and exits like maps. But Leela's face, bright, unarmored, sat under his ribs like embers. He had already tasted the way the pack's suspicion turned to teeth. To refuse was to hand them a weapon. To accept was to lay down his privacy on an altar and hope the gods were merciful. "I will do it," he said. His voice did not tremble as much as his hands. The decision landed like a stone in his chest. Irrevocable, heavy, necessary. Mara's eyes softened so briefly it might have been imagined. "You understand the risk," she said. "The ritual will bind scent to truth. If the blood ties you, the pack will be obliged to honor you as kin. If not—" She did not finish. The knot was a canyon she did not wish to step into. They prepared in the hush before the moon rose high. Celine worked at Elias's wrists and shoulders, tracing the old sigils with fingers that were surprisingly gentle for a woman who kept a ledger of pain. Lila, unbidden, arrived with a small bundle of herbs and the remnant of a blanket Elias recognized, threaded with the same faded pattern he had given Mara years ago. She laid it across his knees like a benediction and then, as if she had been practicing courage, slid her small hand into his. The contact was quiet but alive, a tether he had not known he needed. The elders gathered beneath the ash, the old matriarch who had taught the rites, Mara's fiercest beta, and 2 sentries whose loyalty was as complicated as the lines on their palms. The ritual required openness, no guards at the borders, no tricks, no hidden witnesses. The valley itself was to be witness, stone and fir and moon, so that if politics attempted to smother truth, it would not find a seam to slide through. Elias felt naked in a way that had nothing to do with skin and everything to do with history. The elders chanted, low and rhythmic, the language of binding that sat somewhere between song and oath. Celine pressed a gray stone to his forehead, cold and pitted, and the scent of wolfberries and wet pine rose. The air tasted like old promises. Mara stood across from him, hands folded to keep from reaching for him. Her face was a map of contained turbulence. When the elders asked him to speak what he remembered, Elias did not fold into the measured story he had rehearsed. Instead, he allowed the memory to spill, honest and ragged. He spoke of the rain and the firelight, of bread passed between cold fingers, of a laugh that softened a woman who had never before been allowed to soften. He told of choosing to leave, of the sharp logic of survival, of the nights he had lain awake imagining a child's face and wondering whether his cowardice had killed a possibility he could not yet name. Silence swallowed his words like a tide. Then Mara spoke, slow, each syllable a deliberate exhale. "And you, child," she said, turning to Leela, "what do you know of him?" Leela's reply was not a recitation, but a small, fierce truth. She stood, and, with the composure of someone who had been taught to hide tenderness and had refused, she told them of knots, of songs, of the way Elias had pressed a coin into her palm and told her to remember the feel of metal when fear came. She spoke of the nights she had wept without knowing why, and of the man who had told her tears were not a betrayal but a language. The rite demanded scent then. Lila pressed her forehead to Elias's, an intimacy that made the elders shift. The world narrowed to that contact, skin, breath, and the old ash watching with patient branches. The matriarch murmured, then raised a palm and let drops of blood bead into the hollow of the bark where the roots drank. The ash drank secrets. The elders held their breaths. The scent of the valley swelled, wolf and human, and something that was both and neither. For a suspended moment, the valley balanced on a blade. When the matriarch finally spoke, the voice was thin with age, but steady. "There is kin," she said. The syllables fell like small thunder. Around the ash, the pack exhaled, as if truth had come to set them free or to chain them. Mara's knees went weak, and she had to steady herself. Elias felt as if someone had cut open his chest and replaced his old beating with a new drum. Joy did not arrive in the grand way he had imagined. It came as a trembling, as something fragile that could be clapped apart by a misstep. Lila laughed then, a sound like water, and hurled herself into Elias's arms. He held her with an awkwardness born of stranger and newly claimed father both. Mara watched them, and, in that watching, the hardness around her softened enough for him to see the rawness beneath. Fear for her child, fear of leverage, but also, dangerous and astonishing, a glimmer of gratitude. The victory was not uncontested. The rival Alpha Scouts, watching patterns like blood readers, tried to stir unrest. A contingent of mercenaries pushed toward the southern pass with the intent of demonstrating force. They were met, however, by a pack that no longer breathed as a single unit of suspicion. Many who had been tempted by the rivals' promises balked when they saw a child embrace her new father, saw a queen willing to bear vulnerability in the open. The sight complicated predictions. Some betas who had advocated for political marriages found themselves shamed by the tenderness they had scorned. War, for the moment, receded like a tide pushed back by a new moon. The rival Alpha, calculating and slow to abandon a prize, retreated to consider options. His threat did not vanish, it transformed. He now weighed whether to press open conflict or to parley with a court that had proven unpredictable. For Elias and Mara, the retreat bought them a different enemy, the pack's own internal reckonings, ambition, envy, loyalty bent into weapons. Mara did not immediately trust the verdict of ritual as love's proof. She received Leela into her arms, and then once more into the cold geometry of statecraft. She crafted decrees to protect the child's status and to formalize Elias's access, gently binding his presence into law without granting him power. The move was clever. She granted proximity, curated influence, and retained command. Elias accepted those terms with an understanding born of long marches and harder choices. He had not wanted power, he had wanted permission to be present. The law, thin and provisional, gave him enough to teach knots, sing songs, and to be called father and public without being stripped for it. He learned quickly that politics were an animal he would have to feed with patience and humility. In the days that followed, he taught Leela how to tie a knot that did not come undone, hands guiding fingers that had once been adept at pulling arrows, but not at sewing. He showed her how to mend a frayed rope and how to mend a life in small, stubborn ways. They walked the border together, Mara sometimes at a distance, watching them as if measuring how their intimacy shifted the pack's weather. It shifted the weather, slow rain instead of the lightning that had cracked before. The valley, cautious, began to accept a new pattern, a queen who could falter and a man who could stand. Yet redemption required more than ritual and decree. The elders insisted Elias meet with families of those he had once wronged, the merchants whose caravans had been endangered by his choices, the soldiers whose plans had been compromised. He stood before them and answered for things he had done in the name of survival. His confession was not grand, it was granular. For each harm he admitted, he offered restitution. For each betrayal, he laid down tokens, a restored map, a returned ledger, a promise, not that trust would return, but that he would not be absent again.
It was the simplest acts, the small returns, that did more to bind the pack's fractured edges than any pronouncement. Handing back a stolen favor, mending a broken wheel, sitting with a widow to listen to her grief. These were the stitches that made the ritual's claims real. Mara watched him do it, and slowly, the fierce armor she had worn for years loosened enough for their private moments to be less a policy and more a place. The night the rival Alpha's scouts slipped again toward the southern pass, Mara did not send her betas alone. She called Elias to ride with the flank, not because his muscle changed the calculus, but because his presence signaled something subtler. The pack had room for a human's courage, and the queen had room for mercy. Their joined flank moved like a statement, a queen and a man bound to a child, an arrangement that complicated the tidy arithmetic of conquest. Under the charged sky, with wolves replying to the moon like an answering hymn, Elias rode beside Mara and felt the quiet claiming of a man who had offered himself wholly. He would need to pay a price yet. Political enemies remained, and the rival Alpha would not relent. But in the small, dangerous constellation that it formed, queen, child, father, there was now a claim made public and binding. It was not a throne conquered nor a war won. It was something more precarious, trust rebuilt in the open, piece by piece. When the scouts returned, routed and warned, the valley breathed something that was close to relief. Mara and Elias stood side by side as they debriefed, not as monarch and subject, but as allies who had chosen to be exposed for the sake of a child. It was a fragile alliance, a thing that required vigilance and humility and the willingness to be seen. Elias realized then that redemption was not a single act, but a continuous offering, an ongoing tending to a knot that, once tied, needed daily care. In the weeks that followed, the pack's silence softened into conversation. The betas who had leapt for fracture retreated to more cautious stances. Some elders leaned into the new arrangement with surprised affection, as if they had been given permission to let tenderness in. Mara, for all her calculation, found small joys. Lila's laugh became less guarded, Elias's hands less calloused from soldiering and more used to mending. The valley did not become idyllic overnight. Its fractures remained visible, as all healed things are, but the edges began to knit. Redemption was, in the end, not a grand ceremony, but a series of choices made in the open. Elias's claim to fatherhood had been sealed by ritual, but it was truly forged in the mundane, in returning favors, in teaching knots, in answering accusation with humility. Mara's claim to mercy had been hardened by the need to protect, but softened by the sight of her child's joy. Together, they discovered that love in a world of wilderness is not the absence of danger. It is the willingness to stand in it for the sake of someone who will one day call you family. On a morning washed clean by rain, Elias and Lila sat beneath the ash and tied a new knot, a braid in 2 hands that would not come undone easily. Mara watched from a short distance, arms folded, mouth unaccustomed to smiling. When she finally did, it was small and sharp, and everything the valley needed to begin to believe in the risky, beautiful project they had undertaken, to be a family, not because law demanded it, but because they had chosen it in full sight of moon and pack. The valley learned to breathe around new rules. Days that once snapped with the quick clang of command now carried quieter rituals. Elias teaching Lila how to square a knot while Mara stood nearby, the queen's hands folded so carefully that each small unclenching read like mercy. The pack watched and relearned how to trust a shape that did not fit their old scripts. Neither peace nor victory arrived like a trumpeted decree. They built like threads, slow and stubborn. Elias mended wagons for merchants whose caravans he had once jeopardized. He sat through councils and answered for past choices without glamour, offering restitution where his words could not repair.
Each small act, an apology returned with steady hands, a promise kept, softened suspicion into something less brittle. Rival threats did not vanish, but shifted. The rival Alpha tested the borders twice more, and each time Mara met him with calculated force and a patience sharpened by the knowledge that she now had something to defend that was not merely territory. Elias rode with her, not as an ornamental human, but as a witness whose presence complicated the predator's calculus. When the Valley scouts returned with news of retreat, their eyes looked to the trio, queen, child, father, and saw a mosaic no longer easy to break. Inside the court, rules were rewritten in small print, a measured access for Elias, protections for Leela, and a law against exploiting tender things for gain. It was enough to unsettle those who wanted quick power, and enough to anchor those who had wearied of constant sharpened teeth. Mara learned to accept help not as an erosion of authority, but as a muscle that could be strengthened by careful use. Elias learned that power could be claimed through endurance and care rather than conquest. Lila grew deliberately into both her names, Wild and Held. On a rain-washed morning beneath the ash, the three of them braided rope together, fingers nodding, hands passing, laughter surprising the air. Mara's smile arrived late and small but honest. Elias's voice was softer now, threaded with something like belonging. Lila tied the final knot, pulled it taut, and held it up to the light as if offering the valley a promise. Around them the pack stirred, not silent but listening. The new normal was not a quiet surrender of danger. It was the deliberate choosing to remain together in spite of it. The final image that settled into the valley's memory was simple and fierce. Three silhouettes under the ash, a child's hand inside an adult's, a knot that would not come undone. Even when the moon rose and old instincts howled, they would remain bound by the small, brave work of staying.